Hey everyone, today we're diving into one of the most epic battles in history, the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. This clash happened on December 2, 1805, and it's a highlight of the Napoleonic Wars. Picture this, Napoleon and his French Grande Armée, up against a larger Austro-Russian force. The odds seemed against the French, but Napoleon pulled off a stunning victory that solidified French dominance in Europe for nearly a decade. So, how did we get to this epic showdown? Let's rewind a bit. In May 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. This move freaked out a lot of European leaders. British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger seized the moment to rally a bunch of countries, including the UK, Austria, Russia, Sweden, Naples, and Sicily, into a coalition against France. Napoleon, always the strategic genius, didn't waste time. He led his Grand Armée across the Rhine and swiftly crushed an Austrian force in the Ulm campaign by October 1805. With this victory, the French marched into Vienna on November 13, 1805. But capturing the Austrian capital was just the beginning. Napoleon found himself in a tricky spot, with his forces spread thin and a massive combined army of Austrians and Russians closing in. He knew he had to act smart. Near the town of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic, Napoleon lured the Allies into attacking. The result? A crushing defeat for the Austro-Russian army. The Russians retreated, and the Austrians quickly sought peace, leading to the Treaty of Pressburg. This treaty not only took Austria out of the war, but also set the stage for the end of the Holy Roman Empire the next year. Now, let's talk about how Napoleon captured Vienna. By August 1805, the Third Coalition was gearing up to push France back to its pre-war borders. Austrian Archduke Charles and his 96,000 troops headed to northern Italy, while another Austrian army, led by General Karl Mack, marched into Bavaria. Mack planned to link up with Russian reinforcements and strike at France. However, things didn't go as planned. The Russians, under Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, were delayed by bad roads, and Mack found himself isolated in Ulm. Napoleon, meanwhile, was ready. Originally planning an invasion of England, he pivoted and moved his massive 210,000-strong Grand Armée to the Rhine. By September 25, 1805, they crossed into Germany with lightning speed. Within days, they reached the Danube, overwhelming Mack's forces and trapping them in Ulm. With no Russian reinforcements in sight, Mack had to surrender on October 20, 1805. In less than a month, Napoleon had wiped out a major part of the Allied forces. Kutuzov's Russians finally arrived but were vastly outnumbered. Retreating east, they tried to avoid a major battle until more Allied forces could join them. The French pursued, but when the Russians burned the bridges behind them as they crossed the Danube, French Marshal Joachim Murat turned his attention to capturing Vienna. Using a clever ruse, Murat seized the crucial Tabor Bridge, and the French marched into Vienna on November 14. Napoleon even spent the night at the Schönbrunn Palace, marking a triumphant entry into the Austrian capital. Despite his recent victories, Napoleon found himself in a precarious situation. He was deep in enemy territory, and his army was stretched thin, with troops needed to guard supply lines in garrison towns. By late November, he only had about 75,000 soldiers available. Meanwhile, the coalition forces were growing stronger by the day. After taking Vienna, Marshal Murat had let the Russian army slip away, allowing General Kutuzov to reach the safety of Austerlitz, now Olomouc. There, Kutuzov joined forces with another Russian army under General Friedrich Wilhelm von Buxhoeveden. The Allied army now numbered 90,000 and was joined by Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Francis II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Napoleon also faced threats from other directions. Archduke Charles was being held up in Italy by French Marshal André Massena, but he could potentially break out and threaten Napoleon's rear. Additionally, Prussia, which had remained neutral so far, was considering joining the coalition, which could add another 180,000 troops against the French. Knowing he had to act quickly, Napoleon wanted to force a decisive battle but lacked the strength to be the aggressor. So he devised a plan to lure the Allies into attacking him on his terms. On November 21st, Napoleon sent a third of his army towards Brunn and Wischau, including Marshal Soult's 4 corps and Marshal Lange's corps, which took up positions on the Pratzen Heights near Austerlitz. The Pratzen Heights were strategically crucial, and Napoleon recognized their importance, instructing his staff to carefully examine the ground, hinting that it would soon be a battlefield. A few days later, on November 25th, Napoleon sent General Savary to the Allied camp to propose an armistice, pretending to want to avoid battle. This move surprised the Allied commanders, who believed Napoleon was seeking a truce because his position was weak. Their suspicions seemed confirmed when Napoleon pulled his troops off the Pratzen Heights. The Allies assumed no commander would abandon such a strong position unless he lacked the strength to defend it. On November 27th, Tsar Alexander sent his aide-de-camp, Prince Dolgorukov, to negotiate with Napoleon. Dolgorukov, arrogant and dismissive, reported back that the French appeared weak and suggested that the Allied forces could easily defeat them. However, not everyone in the Allied camp was convinced. Kutuzov and other senior commanders suggested withdrawing to the Carpathian Mountains to draw Napoleon further into enemy territory. But Tsar Alexander, eager to prove his bravery, was swayed by his advisors, who argued for an immediate attack to avoid looking cowardly. "Cowards?" Alexander retorted. "Then it is better for us all to die." On November 30th, the Allied forces advanced towards Austerlitz, pushing aside the French cavalry brigade in a skirmish at Wischau. Tsar Alexander, unaccustomed to the horrors of war, was disturbed by the sight of corpses and retreated to the rear, refusing to eat for the rest of the day. By December 1st, the Allies had climbed the Pratzen Heights, believing they held a significant advantage. However, they had walked right into Napoleon's carefully laid trap. And on the eve of the battle, Napoleon was busy with a campaign of deception. He had asked for an armistice and withdrawn his troops from the Pratzen Heights to make the Allies think he was weak. When Dolgorukov visited the French camp, Napoleon acted anxious and staged a scene of soldiers preparing to retreat. Even the defeat at Wischau was orchestrated, with his cavalrymen instructed to feign panic during their retreat. With the Allies now positioned on the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon was ready to move to the next phase of his plan. He deliberately weakened his right flank, hoping to entice the Allies to attack there. In reality, only a third of Napoleon's army was at Austerlitz, while the corps of Marshals Bernadotte and Davout were hurrying up from Vienna. The right flank's role was to hold the line until Davout's 3 corps could reinforce them, freeing up the rest of the French army to strike at key points on the battlefield. The Allies fell for the bait. Austrian Chief of Staff Franz von Weyrother planned to attack the French right flank with 3 of the army's 5 columns, totaling 59,000 men, under General Buxtehude. Their goal was to break through the French right and then swing north to envelop the rest of Napoleon's forces. While this main attack unfolded, another 13,000 men under Bagration would make a diversionary attack on the French left, and the center would be held by Grand Duke Constantine and the Russian Imperial Guard. Tsar Alexander approved the plan and appointed Weyrother as the commander-in-chief, replacing the cautious Kutuzov. As night fell over Austerlitz, Napoleon received confirmation that Davout's corps would arrive in time for the battle the next morning. After a brief nap and a modest dinner of potatoes and fried onions, Napoleon and his chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, visited their troops, chatting with the soldiers who were in high spirits, singing and dancing at the sight of their emperor. The next day, December 2nd, 1805, was the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, which the soldiers took as a lucky omen. At 4 a.m., Napoleon held a final conference with his officers on a small hillock called the Zaron. He made sure every man knew his role. Marshal Soult's 4 corps would hold the right flank until reinforced by Davout. Marshal Lange's corps would hold the left flank, to be reinforced by Bernadotte's I corps. Once the bulk of the Allied army was engaged, Generals Hilaire and Vandam's divisions would attack the weakened Allied center and retake the heights. And the battle begins. At 4 a.m., French soldiers moved into their positions under a bitterly cold night. As dawn broke, thick mists concealed the size of each army. The battle began at 7 a.m. when Austrian General Kinmeier's advance guard struck the village of Telnitz on the far right of the French line. Heavy fighting ensued, with the French 3rd Regiment holding out for an hour before being pushed out of Telnitz, their retreat covered by Davout's cavalry. The Allies then pushed towards the nearby village of Sokolnitz. By 8:30 a.m., a heavy Allied bombardment forced the French out of Sokolnitz, and in the confusion, they were accidentally fired upon by their own units. However, Sokolnitz remained in Allied hands for only 15 minutes before a French counterattack from Davout's 3 Corps retook it. Davout's brother-in-law, General Louis Friant, led a division that recaptured Telnitz, while General Legrand's 2 brigades, one a Corsican unit nicknamed the Emperor's Cousins, recaptured Sokolnitz. Soon they faced 12 Russian battalions. By 9:30 a.m., the Russians had stormed Sokolnitz castle, killing or wounding 11 of the 12 most senior French commanders in the village. The villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz changed hands several times throughout the morning, becoming the most contested part of the battlefield. Meanwhile, on the left, Bagration's forces engaged Marshal Lanvicourt in fierce fighting around Blasowitz. Although Lannes was soon reinforced by Bernadotte's I Corps, the situation grew desperate as his men were battered by Bagration's artillery. Lannes rallied his troops and retook Blasowitz at bayonet point. To relieve pressure, Murat led 3,000 horsemen in a charge against Bagration's cavalry. Despite being outnumbered, Murat's charge succeeded, causing the Allied horse to break and flee in a chaotic retreat. And by 9 a.m., the Allies had concentrated 40,000 men against the French right, which was gradually being reinforced by Davout's troops. As the morning mists cleared, Napoleon saw that the Allies had weakened their center by pulling more troops off the heights, exactly as he had anticipated. Seizing the moment, he ordered Marshal Soult to attack the enemy center, declaring, "Let us finish this war with a thunderclap." The divisions of Hilaire and Vandam, hidden by the mists at the foot of the heights, were given triple rations of brandy to boost their morale before being ordered to advance. As they marched, the famous son of Austerlitz burned away the remaining mists, and thousands of French bayonets sparkled in the sunlight. The Allies were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the French divisions. Kutuzov quickly ordered Collares' Austrians to return to the heights, and at 9:30, intense fighting erupted around the village of Pratzen near the summit. The battle here was fierce, with neither side taking prisoners and the wounded being mercilessly killed. The struggle for Pratzen lasted for more than an hour until 11 a.m., when Marshal Soult brought up 6 12-pounder guns and began bombarding the Allied positions. By midday, the Allies were retreating from the high ground, leaving it in French hands. With Buxtehude's column still engaged on the French right and Bagration tied down on the left, the Allied army was effectively split in two. Now, the only significant threat to a French victory was the Russian Imperial Guard. At 1 p.m., Grand Duke Constantine led 4 battalions of the Russian Guard cavalry in a desperate attempt to reclaim the heights. The French 4th Regiment of the line broke under this charge, losing their Imperial Eagle standard. As the 4th line retreated in panic, they still had the presence of mind to shout, "Vive l'Empereur!" as they ran past Napoleon. In response, the French Emperor sent 5 squadrons of his own Imperial Guard cavalry to counter the Russian attack. The 2 elite units clashed in a brutal battle atop the Pratzen Heights. The Russian Guard wavered and eventually broke, ending all hope of an Allied victory. Despite sustaining a sword wound to the head, Jean Rapp, one of Napoleon's aides-de-camp, presented the Emperor with captured Russian colors and prisoners, including Prince Nikolai Rupnin-Volkonsky. This dramatic moment was later immortalized in François Gérard's famous painting of the battle. With the Russian Guard defeated, Hilaire and Vandamme were sent to flank the Russian battalions fighting at Sokolnitz and Telnitz. At 2 p.m., Davout ordered his corps forward in a general counterattack, coldly instructing his men to let not one escape. By 3 p.m., the Allies were in full retreat, with many of them fleeing across the frozen lakes. Napoleon ordered 25 cannons to fire at the ice, sending Russian troops plunging into the freezing waters below. The exact number of Russians who drowned is disputed. Napoleon claimed it was 2,000, though modern scholars estimate 200 or less. By 4:30, the last sounds of musket fire died away, and the French were left in control of the battlefield. The French lost 1,305 killed and a further 6,940 wounded, but these numbers paled in comparison to the Allied losses. 11,000 Russians and 4,000 Austrians lay dead or wounded on the field of Austerlitz, with a further 12,000 Allies captured. In total, the Allies suffered 27,000 casualties, or a third of their initial strength. Napoleon observed, "Many fine ladies will weep tomorrow in St. Petersburg." This was the decisive victory Napoleon sought. Tsar Alexander withdrew into Hungary with the remnants of his army, while Emperor Francis sued for peace. The battle ended the War of the Third Coalition and solidified the French Empire's military supremacy on the European continent for most of the next decade.